Blackouts. I'm not entirely sure if what happened to me was an encounter, per se, but I know that whatever it was, it started midway through the third quarter of 7th grade, and didn't end until the winter of my freshman year in high school. Around the beginning of this occurrence, my parents and I were in a bit of a difficult situation. We had just moved out of our apartment and had no permanent lodgings for the time being. Unfortunately, this particular situation lasted for a long time, and we periodically moved between our friend Bob's house and my grandma's place, 2 full towns away from where I went to school, and as you can guess, that was pretty stressful for me, especially since it was technically illegal for me to continue attending school in my hometown, and my parents could get in serious trouble with the cops for it. Anyway, it was a few weeks after we moved out that things started happening. And honestly, it started out small. Just some simple stuff that I could have easily cast aside as a coincidence or accidents. Especially at Bob's, since my parents and I shared a room. For instance, I would set my phone down next to my little pallet on the floor and find it on top of the TV moments later. It was perfectly reasonable to assume my mom had moved it so she wouldn't accidentally step on it. I never did bother asking her about it. That just seemed silly at the time. But as time went on, things only got worse. Almost 2 months after we moved out of the apartment, and about 6 weeks after moving in with Bob for the first time, the blackouts started. The first one I almost managed to ignore. I was playing a game on the PlayStation 2 we had in our room, and as it was rather late, I was starting to get tired. This tiredness is what made me want to write the blackout off as nothing, just drifting off for a short nap or something simple and mundane like that. But regardless, I remember that I was still playing somewhat enthusiastically, halfway through a rather difficult level. I wanted to finish before I went to bed, but once I had cleared an ambush of enemies, suddenly, everything gets hazy for a moment in my memory. Hazy, and then there was blackness for a while. I opened my eyes, thinking, as I've mentioned, that I had fallen asleep. There was little, at first, to dispute this. The game was paused and the controller rested next to me, and I faintly remembered hitting the pause button before the blackness. It took me a minute or two to realize that something was off, and what it was that was wrong came to me in pieces soon after. My left arm felt sore, and I felt incredibly cold. It wasn't until I looked toward the end of my pallet that I realized just how wrong things were. My bare feet were covered in mud and grass, and when I decided to examine further, there were also pine needles mixed among the grass and mud. But I had taken a shower before laying down to play my game, and I hadn't been outside since much earlier that day, when everything had been very dry. By this point, I was more than just a little confused. Sure, I knew that around midnight, which it had been when I first showered, the grass was more than just a little bit wet with dew every night, but that didn't explain why I had even been outside, or what I had been doing. The pine needles suggested I'd wandered into the road in front of Bob's trailer. Needless to say, I was inclined not to sleep for the rest of the night. After that, the blackouts happened relatively often, and my mother mentioned witnessing me suddenly going very pale in the face and wandering out of the trailer, glassy-eyed, mouth slightly open, during one of my blank spots. She thought nothing of it since I occasionally get very tired of being inside, which usually causes me to feel so sick that I have to rush outside to get some fresh air. However, after she mentioned it, things got worse for me. The blackouts started happening more and more often and for longer periods of time. At first, I lost maybe an hour or so of the day or night at most. But as time went on, I started to lose increasingly larger amounts of time. Within a month, I was losing almost entire days. I couldn't remember anything I had done. I even started forgetting things that had happened when I wasn't blacked out. And possibly most disturbing, my favorite jacket began to reek of cigarette smoke. This concerned me, as my father only smoked e-cigs at the time, and no one else around me smoked. And it continued like that well into my 8th grade year, even after we moved away from Bob's to my grandmother's. This is especially concerning to me because had this been a spiritual encounter, as I was sure it was before then, it should have either stopped entirely when we moved there or increased significantly. My grandmother lives in her church, where she preaches every Wednesday and Saturday. But the blackouts continued in the same manner they had gone on all summer. They continued that way all through the 8th grade, though luckily they didn't have much bearing on my schoolwork. Apparently I did better work when I blacked out, but for a short while that year, even stranger things would happen. I figure it was caused by the stress of my math teacher's constantly raised voice and the mandatory science fair that I didn't participate in. But I found that during that time period, when I would black out, I would come out of it with bruises on my knuckles and arms, sometimes with bits of skin peeled off in my right index finger. Almost a year later, the blackouts had begun to finally decrease in frequency, though not in length. In fact, they actually grew longer as they grew less frequent. They grew so long that I would lose entire school days. But second quarter, they stopped. I wish I could say they stopped for good, but that's not the case. I was glad of the fact that I could finally make it through a week without having an entire day missing from my memory, but my happiness was short-lived. Soon after the start of second quarter and the temporary end of blackouts, I met a new friend. This seemed like a good thing. In fact, we're still friends to this day. But upon actually befriending her, something much worse than blackouts overtook me. I couldn't tell where my imagination ended and reality began, and while that in itself didn't startle or disturb me, my imagination had taken a dark turn as of late. I saw gruesome things, events I would never wish on anyone, happening to every teacher that had the misfortune of offending me or hurting my feelings. Often it was my PE teacher. I tried to put my thoughts aside, however, and be a functioning human being. Weeks later, it stopped being a problem, but I welcomed it and the blackouts both in light of the replacement. Hellish nightmares began to plague my already rare sleep. Insomnia had long since taken me over, but with the nightmares, I barely managed to get an hour of sleep every night. Right before the sun came up. I don't remember the subject matter of any of these nightmares, but I'm glad of that. I was, for once, thankful for my persisting memory problems that had already arisen with the blackouts, and continue even now. Everything spiraled into a crescendo after the nightmares started. Soon, the blackout started again, and my right hand developed a persistent urge to make me pop my knuckles, all of it leading up to a day in the woods. My friend and I had decided that eating lunch in the woods behind the school would be a good way to get some fresh air and get away from people. Get away from all the noise. Maybe help me calm down a bit, although she didn't know about any of my problems. She could tell I was stressed and upset, not to mention tired. Very, very tired. The first part of lunch passed without incident. We ate in relative silence, listening to the birds above us chirp and chatter away. It was peaceful to some extent. Then it happened. The birds went silent, and an eerie, buzzing noise took their place. I went stiff. I could hear someone talking, but it sounded far away. "Do you hear that?" my friend asked, eyebrows knitted together. I could only nod. "The buzzing?" Another nod. "The whispering?" She almost hesitated. I don't know what possessed us to do this, but we got up and abandoned our lunch at the top of the hill we were on and headed down, further into the woods. We wound through it, both of us feeling as though we were being pulled by an unseen force. Dread was tying my stomach in knots. Whatever was wrong with me, I knew that something bad was coming. I'll admit now that I felt bad after I made my split-second decision in the woods, but I may have saved my own life. Still winding through the trees with my friend, I felt the pulling growing stronger, and the knot in my stomach turned into a rock in my throat. I turned around faster than I could comprehend my own choice and bolted back the way we came in a straight line, tripping over roots and barely getting around trees. Luckily, my friend made the same decision, and we both got out of the woods all right. And my friend claims that once I had apparently escaped the woods, the pulling had slowly lessened, then stopped. She also mentioned that she heard someone yelling my nickname before the pulling stopped. I hadn't told her this, but I heard it too, as I gathered my things from the hill and made a beeline for the school at top speed. I had thought it was her, but the feelings of the eyes on the back of my head told me it wasn't her, and that I should keep running. I had a nervous breakdown when it sank in how much danger I could have been in. For a week afterwards, my blackouts occurred in tandem, happening ridiculously often, but for very short spurts of time. Almost as if some unseen puppeteer were fighting to regain control of me. The nightmares got so much worse, and my constant urge to pop my right hand's knuckles became the urge to gnaw at my index and middle fingers on that hand. But at the end of that week, everything suddenly stopped. It's been more than a year since then, and it's been a good one. I had forgotten how it felt to operate like a normal person, to not lose days to blackouts that I couldn't control. In fact, I had been having them for so long that it felt weird for a while not to have them anymore. Things have been going so well, but recently, I think I've started to lose some time again. I'm scared, and unfortunately all of this is true. I'm so frightened, and because of that, I am taking all of my energy and willpower to finally get the story out so someone knows.